Hi everyone, today we're going to learn Next.js. Next.js is a React-based framework. If you already know React, Next shouldn't be difficult to pick up. So why do we need a framework for React? Next is used for server-side rendering and static site generation on top of regular React features. We'll focus on server-side rendering here, and I'll have another set of tutorials for static site generation. Server-side rendering is basically just rendering the React components on the server so they can access the database directly. And since the initial HTML will be rendered on the server, it's more search engine friendly. After a component is rendered on the server side and the static HTML is sent to a browser, the component will get executed again on the front end, but this time it will not render because it's already been rendered on the server side. So what it will do is to reuse the static HTML, and it will go through a process called hydration or rehydration. Hydration means reusing the server-side generated HTML for the components running on the client side. The point of hydration is to avoid unnecessary rendering. The end result is that we will still be running a normal React app on the front end, but the initial rendering of the app will be done on the server beforehand. First, let's create a new Next app. When it's done, get inside the app folder and run the development server. You should see the default sample homepage at port 3000. The main mechanism of server-side rendering is a combination of page component and the get server-side props callback. These are the two most important things for understanding Next.js. We'll start with page component. A page component is a file that contains a React component, and the name of the file will be used as a route. So for this default component, if we go to the index path, we'll see the default page. Let's remove this default content and add some of our own JSX. And the page will get automatically reloaded. For demonstration, let's create a second page called About. Let's copy the code from the home page to the new page and modify some of the content. Let's change the page heading and add some additional content. Finally, change the component name. Once again, we don't have to set up a route like what you would do with Express.js. We simply just name the file with the route itself. If we want a deeper route like this, we can put the file inside a folder, and the folder name will become part of the route. Because this file is now inside a folder, we have to add 2 extra dots to the path of any file import. Not all components in your Next.js app have to be page components. In fact, most of them will not be. You only need the page component if you want it to be directly accessed through a URL. And page components can import other regular React components. Now let's talk about the get server-side props callback. Each component can be accompanied by a callback. This get server-side props callback will receive the request info as a parameter. We have to return the props, which will be injected into the components down here. Create some random data. And we can receive the items here as props. Let's use a loop to render the items. Let's remove the default CSS so that the page content is not centered. So why passing the props in directly like this? Why not just put this inside the component? The reason is that these 2 units of code, they don't always execute at the same place or the same time. This callback will only run on the server side because it has access to backend resources and modules, such as the ones for database access. On the other hand, the component itself will be rendered on both server and client. When the page is first requested, the component will be rendered on the server, and once it arrives on the front end, it will become part of a single page app. And from that point on, it will be rendered on the client whenever it needs rendering. So this part has to look like a normal React component because it also runs on the front end. We'll come back and expand on this when we have two connected page components. As I said, this callback function can access anything on the server. So let's create a mock database object on the server. It has two functions. One function returns all the items, and the other function returns an item based on an ID. And now we can import it into this page and call it here to get the data. And returning the data from the callback will make them available to the component. Let's change this to render the name and set the ID as the key. There's a strange head element used inside the default component. This is a built-in component from Next.js. The stuff you put inside will be rendered as the content of the head in the final HTML. So this will not be rendered at the same place as it appears here in the JSX. Link is another commonly used built-in element provided by Next.js. This can be used for creating links between different pages. Let's create an item page to demonstrate this. Let's copy the code from the home page as the starting point for the item page. This page will be used to display the information of a single item. This item page will receive the ID as a query parameter and get the corresponding data from the database, and then pass the data as a prop to the component down here. Let's remove this and render the item name and the price. Finally, change the name of the component. Now we can just use the item URL with an ID in the query string to access the item page. Back in the home page, we have to set up the links so that each item will have a link with an ID that points to the second page. First, import the link element. Now we can use the link element in the JSX. Now we can click on each item to get to the item page. If we don't want to use query string for the URLs, we want something that looks like this. We have to use dynamic route. We just have to change the file name using the square brackets. The use of square brackets means that this ID is a dynamic value. If the path is item-1, then 1 will be available inside the query property of the request object. And if we want a path like this, we will have to create a folder and name it item, and put a file inside a folder and name it with the square brackets and ID. Now that the file is one level down, we have to update the input path of the data file. Let's check out the app again in the browser. Now that we have two pages linked together, let's come back and talk about this get server-side props function. As I said, this will only run on the server. It will never run on the client. If you put a console log message here, go back out to the browser and click back and forth between the two pages, you'll see the log messages in the console. This means that this callback function runs every time we visit the home page, even after the initial rendering. Next.js will send this props object as JSON from the server side back to the client side. You can use the dev tool to see the JSON response. This is all done for you automatically behind the scene, so you don't have to worry about how to trigger this function whenever a user is visiting the homepage. One last thing before we go, which is kind of important that you need to be aware of. Although the callback itself is run on a per request basis, but the environment that this callback is running in, it's shared across all clients. That means if we have a count variable here, like this, one client requests to run the callback that increments this count. When this callback is run for other clients, it will see the updated count, not the original initial 0. That's because they're sharing the same environment, so you should not put any user-specific data in a variable like this. That's it for part A. In part B, we'll explore the API creation feature of Next.js.